Book 8, The Last Day, Chapter 3, The 32nd Day of Planting, Part 2 of 3. Eltana Jordan had been expecting the knock at her door. Ever since the meeting at the arena yesterday, she'd been hearing rumors about men gathering, and she knew it was only a matter of time before they sought her out. A few had gone to Colonel John Offra for ideas, but he slammed the door in their faces and refused to discuss defense with any of them, the cowardly man. He'd vanished shortly after that, probably already running scared up to the ancient temple site. She opened the door and smiled at the group of 20 men who stood there. "Mrs. Eltana Jordan," said a man she knew from her armchair generals meetings. "What can I do for you fine gentlemen?" "We need some suggestions." "Yes, you do, Mr. Custer. Come in and sit down. There might be room for all of you." She held the door open wider and assessed them as they filed in. They ranged in ages from late teens to late 60s, and each man was lean, strong, and in far better shape than anyone in the world. That would be their first advantage. When each of the men had found a place to sit or stand in the small gathering room, Eltana shut the door behind her. She loved rooms filled with muscle and power, with men eager to do something with their strength. This was no armchair generals meeting. This was a war council. She sat down in the soft chair in the middle of the room, purposely left for her. And they were true gentlemen. The man who had led them out of the arena yesterday began. "Mrs. Jordan, we're not about to retreat and give all we have to our enemy. We want to stay and fight." "Commendable, Mr. Custer," Eltana said to the burly man in his 30s. He'd never served in the army of Idumea, but had always longed to be a scout. He told Eltana privately last year that his requests as a younger man had been denied. The trainers and guide at the time had thought that he was too aggressive and impulsive. Eltana had thought that summed up Salem's faults perfectly. They embraced the wrong character traits. "And what do you want from me?" she said, although she knew quite well what they wanted. "But you should always make a man work for it." "Strategy, ma'am." "Strategy? Now why seek me out?" she asked almost coyly. "Because you know the ways of the army best," said an eager young man. "You used to be there. You were married to a real general. You knew General Thorne." Mr. Custer held up his hand to calm down the younger man. "Yes, that's why we're here. If anyone would know the ways of the current army, it's you." "And no one else would help you?" Eltana said. "No one else with the reputation of recruiting and training the greatest soldiers in the history of the army?" The men glanced at each other nervously. She waved off their looks. Of course Shem Zenas wouldn't share his expertise. "I'm happy to help. I agree that retreating without even attempting to defend your property is cowardly and stupid. Why, each of you is in better shape than anyone in the world. How many men do you have with you?" Mr. Custer answered. "By last count this morning, about 5,000 men are willing to fight. But we haven't heard back yet from the far north and the dissenter villages. We should be getting word in a few hours, and I suspect we'll have at least double, if not triple, that number." Eltana nodded slowly, thinking. 15,000 men at best. And how many are in the army of Idumea right now?" The men looked at each other again. "The scouts at last count say about 80,000 men. But already a few hundred have been lost to the canyon, and we're hoping many more will fall before they make it to Salem." Eltana squinted. "I estimate they'll lose maybe another 10 to 15,000 before they ever reach Salem. And once they're here, they'll be so weary they won't put up much of a challenge." Many of the men sighed in relief and exchanged smiles. "But," Custer said, "as some have suggested, that's still 65,000 men, and there's a large group of women supposedly coming too." "They're not a concern," Eltana assured him. "Still, that's more than 4 soldiers to each one of us," Custer pointed out. "We'll have a real battle on our hands." 4 flabby, exhausted men with no will of their own against each one of you, rested, strong, and wanting to save your homes, Eltana exclaimed. Never underestimate the desire for survival. Several of the men nodded in appreciation. Exactly. That's what I've been saying. See, we can do this. Custer held up his hands for silence and turned to Mrs. Jordan. I was hoping you'd say something like that. He started to smile. What I said to you were the words of discouragement Guide Zenas offered me before I left him this morning. 4 to 1? We can handle that. He said it'd be far worse. Mrs. Jordan smiled, pleased to see she had more influence than Guide Zenas. Tell me what you have, then we can start considering tactics. Weapons? Pitchforks mostly, ma'am. She made a face. Pitchforks? But we know how to use them, put in another man in his 50s. For years we've been trained with them, in case a rogue group of soldiers happened to make their way over the mountains. General Shin wanted us to be able to defend our families. He always said the reach of a pitchfork was greater than that of a sword, with 4 points at the end of it, so it's more deadly than a sword, too. He made a thrusting motion. Sounds like the Parangshun I used to know, she murmured in appreciation. Louder, she said, That's true. A sharp thrust into the chest can puncture both lungs, incapacitating your man until you can come back later to finish him off, if it's still necessary. A couple of men looked aghast at the idea, but Eltana continued. What else? Knives? Several men nodded. But for butchering animals, one man explained. A pig is a pig, sir, Eltana said. In the field or in a uniform, butcher them both the same way. Slash the throat, stab the heart, or gut it. The young, eager man swallowed hard at the image, and his light brown face began to go white. What else? She asked. The men looked at each other and shrugged. What about hatchets, axes? She suggested. Custer shook his head. General Shin didn't want us using those. He said if we threw them and missed, we just handed another weapon to our enemies. But if you have nothing else, a hatchet will come in handy, she told them, especially in close combat. Don't throw them, hold them. You can sever a limb as easily as a tree branch, and a well-placed hatchet can stop a man's heart or cut the arteries in his neck. You don't need great force to make a man bleed to death. A few of the men shifted, obviously not used to thinking about the many ways to take a man's life. Eltana smirked at their uneasiness. They'd get over their squeamishness soon enough. No one in the world was squeamish anymore. You have bows and arrows for hunting, too, correct? She asked. Again, puncture a man's lung, and he can't do much else but fall to the ground, gasping for breath. Hit him in a vital organ, and he'll collapse from the pain. Even an arrow to the leg means he can't run anymore. Oh, I can tell you a great many ways more to disable a man. But first, let's talk about your strategy. What are you planning? Well, that's where we have some disagreements, Custer said, seemingly relieved to be leaving the topic of hurting other people. Some want to defend their homes, while others think we should combine together and face the army as one. Eltana nodded. That's your best option. But what if a soldier breaks away and runs to one of our properties while we're fighting? Asked one man. Then chase him down and kill him when the battle is over, Eltana said glibly. You have to defeat the entire army, not just some of the men. If you can get the army to surrender, you can deal later with the remaining soldiers as you see fit. The conquered must obey the conquerors. It's always been that way. But you don't know that, do you? What a waste. So you'll help us? Asked Custer. She scoffed. Obviously. But we need to begin as soon as possible. Training should begin early tomorrow morning with every man you have here to learn what I can teach you. We can meet in the fields behind my farm, one man suggested. That's a rather central location. The other men nodded in agreement. Good, Eltana said, "and gather as many weapons as possible. You also need to establish captains over 50s, 100s, and 1000s. Now, this is what needs to happen in the next few hours." "Done with your little nap?" Shin's eyes flew open to see Thorne hovering over him. "I've never seen a man sleep sitting up before, but I guess the dungeon taught you that important skill. So many benefits I never imagined." Shin tried to shake the sleepy fog out of his head. The area was filling up with weary soldiers, not appreciating the view or the slush they stood in. "It's time to move on," Thorne said. "The rest of the army is catching up. Healy said I should let you sleep for 20 minutes so you'd be rested. Well, are you?" He blinked, still confused. "Am I what?" "Rested!" Yes, of course." Shin fumbled to his feet and picked up his pack. How did that happen? He closed his eyes for only a moment to concentrate on what? Strategy. What he was going to do later. And then suddenly he was asleep. Somehow he was sure it was Pugga's fault. He faced north. The glacial valley would still be covered with snow. If anyone had been there or recently left, their tracks would be obvious. If he was the first to see the tracks, maybe he could cover them up. Not that it would do any good, but it would make him feel better. He started walking, wondering who his companion would be for the next couple of miles. Likely not Teach, because Iron was trying to rouse him as he faked unconsciousness rather unconvincingly. Shin would have appreciated Healy by his side, if only to find out how the sergeant major was. Maybe he could heft Thorne's pack for a while, and perhaps accidentally drop it down a ravine. Healy didn't look well at all, and he hadn't said a word to Shin lately. But he was comforted that Healy was concerned about him, letting him take the nap, which was surprisingly refreshing. "So, just a couple of miles this way, is it?" Reg was apparently his designated partner for this leg. "Supposedly." "You're really good at that, you know that?" Reg whispered as he walked alongside. "Not giving away anything? Keeping your emotions to yourself? Great skills for an officer to have." Shin only shrugged. "Did you learn to do that when you were Lieutenant Thorne?" "No." "Learned it before?" "Perhaps." "Trying to keep information away from those you called your family? You know, I don't think I even know who raised you. Those in Salem? Needed to hide your true feelings and such?" Shin sighed. "Oh, what do you want, Reg?" "I don't want anything, Shin, just making small talk." "No, you're not. None of you are here to make small talk," he accused quietly, although the general was at least 40 paces behind. "All of you were acting under Thorne's direction to wheedle as much information out of me as possible." Reg chuckled. "You are very smart, aren't you? Beavid warned us you were. He also said you're paranoid, but that comes from being in the dungeon. We're not supposed to take it personally, and I don't. What was it like, anyway, the dungeon?" "Smelly." Reg chortled again, more enthusiastically than necessary. "So, Buddy and Pal told us. I can't imagine what a miserable existence that must have been. You seem to be in pretty good shape, though. You don't look very starved." "I felt starved." "Maybe someone was helping you?" Shin held his face perfectly still as he continued to walk. The kind of trouble Healy could get into, he didn't want to imagine. But maybe that's why Healy was carrying Thorne's pack, his punishment for feeding extra to the prisoner. "Not that I wouldn't blame someone for taking pity on you," Reg rambled on. "I mean, most men die down there. I heard a few men talking that even though they didn't like you too much, they didn't think you deserved the dungeon. They wanted to find a way to help you. Digging you out was impossible, but maybe sneaking you food? There were several shifts of guards. Maybe one or two of them dropped extra rations through the floorboards. That's happened before. Against all regulations, but then again, dungeons aren't any of the command school books, are they? I've been reading them. I hope to go to command school when all of this is over. Don't think so far, Reg. Shin cut him off. Reg looked over at him eagerly, now that he had an interesting response. Why not plan for the future? Because you have none, Reg. None of us do. This is a stupid endeavor, and we will all die. Reg was silent for a moment. The paranoia, isn't it? You think we will all die? Shin sighed. Thorne's leading us to our deaths, Reg. I'm walking only to keep Cloudman alive a while longer. I'm hoping a cloud will descend low enough that he can walk through it. That is the only thing I'm living for now. We're all going to die, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. It's hopeless. Reg pondered his dire prediction. Definitely the paranoia, because General Thorne is the greatest leader we've ever had. He wouldn't lead us into something if he didn't feel confident we would be victorious. There's no cause more worthy than liberating the captives. There's no purpose greater than saving the people of Idemea. Shin rolled his eyes at the well-rehearsed story. What a marvelous heritage you have, Shin, Reg gushed on. I must confess I'm envious. To have General Lemuel Thorne, the greatest general the world has ever produced, as your father. Sure, he sent you to the dungeon, but my father always locked me up when I was misbehaving. Good fathers reprimand their sons forcefully. The greater the love, the greater the force. Only a man who loves you so deeply would send you to a deep hole in the ground. Shin complimented himself that he didn't burst out laughing. He hadn't laughed in a long time, but this was tempting. I have faith in him, Shin, Reg said adoringly. He's doing the right things for us, for the whole world. He can be trusted, Shin. Keep telling yourself that, Reg. It just might come true. Shin picked up his pace. There was a section coming up where they would have to travel single file, or the person on the outside would slip and fall down the canyon side. He half hoped the general's little toady would do just that. 1 mile later, Reg was still keeping up, but he'd stopped talking. When one gets no response, keeping up a monologue gets tiresome. Shin stared straight ahead as they approached the glacial valley, trying to discern the tall trees that towered above the fort. There was a ladder, nearly impossible to see even when standing right below it, that ran through the length of the tallest pine tree, to afford the man perched on top a clear view for miles around. Shin wondered if anyone was there, if anyone had spotted him and sent a messenger to Salem. But what he worried most of all was, would he be recognized as the first man in the column? Mari was on the front porch helping Jatsi sort out the emergency traveling packs for the great-grandchildren. Once they were sure each pack was filled properly, and they should be, since they did this every year, Jatsi and her children would deliver them to the married children, just in case the black banner with the white sword was hoisted up their tower sooner than they expected. Mari heard the horse approach, but she didn't bother to look up. She knew who it was, and she wasn't interested in what he had to say. Mari Padoshin, I gave you a direct order, Shem said as he dismounted. Jatsi waved in greeting and elbowed her mother, but Mari refused to look up from her work. You were to get your pack as soon as that went up. He jerked a thumb angrily to the banner that signaled the army had been spotted by the glacial fort. Ralph and his family are nearly ready, but you apparently aren't going with them? Mari looked up and smiled sweeter than she felt. No. Shem marched up to the porch. Why not? She nodded at the tower. Don't see any black flags yet, Shem. I can change that, you know, he said, nearly seething. I'll run up your name with the sword banner right now. Is that the kind of attention you want? Mari's smile fell. I'm not that childish, Shem. I'm not looking for attention. Then why are you doing this? Shem began to roar. Mari, I've got enough to worry about." "Yes, you do," she bellowed louder than him. "Why you insist on pestering me when you have greater things to do is beyond my comprehension." "Look, Mari, Perrin would—" "You don't know what Perrin would or would not do, Shemzinas," Mari shouted. Jatsi took a startled step backward. "Perrin knows I'm capable of making my own decisions. My mind is as sharp as ever. I can hear and see and move just fine, just a little slower, and I don't need to be coddled or baby or told what to do. Don't worry. I have no intention to sit on my front porch watching the army of Idamia ravage all that I've loved for the past 27 years. I'll go when I deem the time to be right. And right now, I have grandchildren and great-grandchildren to take care of. And unless you have something else to say to me, Shemzinas, because right now I know you're not acting as the guide, but as my little brother, you best get back to your duties." Mari returned to checking the packs. Jatsi, astonished, looked at Shem. He fumed as he stared at Mari, who refused to acknowledge him. For a moment he made as if he would walk back to his horse, but instead he continued up the steps to the porch. Mari still ignored him, even as Shem took her by the shoulders and forcibly turned her. Without a word, he wrapped his arms around her and kissed the top of her head. Mari stood stiffly for a moment, then, knowing it was useless, relented and put her arms around Shem. Jatsi gave Shem a grateful look. "I'm not babying you, Mari," Shem whispered. "I need your aggravation now more than ever, and I need to know you're on top of that flat mountain, watching our families and making sure everyone up there keeps their heads and wits about them. You can do that for me, for all of Salem. I'm being selfish, Mari. I've tried very hard not to be, but right now I am. Go for me, please, for those at the ancient temple. Let me know that the better half of Parishon is still hard at work securing Salem." Tears trickled down from Mari's eyes, making the front of Shem's tan jacket damp. "Let me wait here for him, Shem. He's coming. He's closing in on the glacial fort, less than a mile away from it." Shem leaned back to look at her. "How do you know that?" "I feel him, Shem. He's coming back to me. He's remembering his promise." Shem glanced at Jatsi. She shrugged. Looking into Mari's face, her eyes bright with hope, Shem asked gently, "What promise?" "He made a promise to stay with young Per, but he also promised me years ago that we would go to the site together. He would stay in Salem until he was sure everyone who wanted to get out was on their way. He wouldn't leave until he saw the army at the canyon entrance. Then he'd get on Clark, whichever number it was, come get me from our dream house, and together we'd ride to the site." Jatsi blinked back her tears. "Oh, Mother, do you understand what's happening? I mean, you know that you can't—" Mari's hopeful face vanished, and she looked sharply at her daughter. "Yes, of course I know that can't happen now. I'm not demented. I see it in both of your faces. Mari Shin's gone grainy. I'm not. Just—" Her eyes softened again as she explained. "He is coming back for me. I may be riding up there with Pato or Cephas or any number of grandsons who'll be cajoled by their parents to come find me, but Perrin will be riding with me when I go. He'll find me here, and I must be here, Shem. Please, let us face the last days we always planned. What will it matter anyway? It's the last day." Shem smiled softly. "That's why Perrin never wanted a gray Clark. I get it now. He always wanted the best descendant of Clark he could find, and it had to be black. It was always on big black horses that captains rescued the maidens in distress from the garters," Mari explained, almost bashfully. "According to those ridiculous stories we had when we were growing up, I used to tease him about it, until we rode from Edge through the forest. Suddenly, I wanted nothing more than to be rescued by him and on Clark. He promised that he'd always rescue me on a big black horse named Clark. Jatesy sniffed. Oh, Mother, he was romantic? I never realized Father was romantic. Mari snorted. Don't you ever tell him I told you this. Shem and Jatesy regarded her with sad smiles. Feeling too much of their sympathy, Mari pushed away from Shem's embrace. Shem, Jates, I just wanted you to understand, and I want you to let me decide when I go, all right? No more coercing or ordering or guilting me, because I know that's next. Let me wait for my husband. Jatesy and Shem exchanged the same dubious look. All right, Mari, Shem said reluctantly. I'll make sure Calla doesn't come by with her speech, although she's been working on it all morning. It's a doozy, too. There's no one quite like Calla for making a point. Mari patted his cheek. Tell her I appreciate it, and I love you all for trying. She glanced at her daughter. Thank you for understanding. I do, Shem said, but I don't like it. Not one bit. Jates, keep an eye on her, will you? Next thing you know, she'll be arming herself with a pitchfork and going over to Altana's for lessons. No, I won't, Mari insisted. Is that where you've been? At Altana's? Shem sighed, almost in despair. She's going to train the Salemites tomorrow morning. Whoever wants to learn what strategy she knows. Shouldn't take too long. I told her she's deceiving them into thinking they'll be ready. They'll only be ready for their deaths. She told me it was better than the alternative. What's the alternative? Jatesy said. Shem shrugged. She couldn't articulate it. She's not thinking straight. None of them are. They're so filled with fear. And, in Altana's case, a desire for vengeance that they can't understand any other course of action. They've lost faith. His voice drifted off. Mari gripped his arm. They haven't lost faith in you, Shem. They've lost faith in everything. Their faith has never been tried before, and now when they're facing a real threat, it's found to be wanting. Didn't Guide Gleese see this, that not everyone would go to the site? If I could just find the right words, he tried again. They'd still not listen, Shem, Jatesy insisted. You said all the right words at the arena yesterday. I could feel the power in them, the spirit of the Creator moving through you. But people can choose to ignore that power and spirit, Shem. We saw it all the time in the world, and the more they ignore it, the harder it is to hear it. You could yell in their faces or whisper into their ears. They will still choose to not believe you. So what do I do? He whispered. You've done all you can do. Help those who want to be helped, Mari said. You can't force the others to follow you. Force is the refuser's tool, not yours. He smiled. That's just what Calla said. I know you're right. All of you are. It's just reassuring to hear it from a few other people I love and respect. I have faith in you, Guide Zanus, Jatesy declared. I always have, ever since I was little. Shem's smile widened. Thanks, Jates. I may come over a few more times to hear those words again. Come over as often as you wish. He turned back to Mari. I have to ask one more time. Please go with Ralph. They're leaving within the hour. Perrin will find you wherever you are. I really don't think he ever envisioned this scenario, Mari. I'm sure he expected to be right here with you, trying to force you on a horse you didn't like riding. Mari patted his cheek again. You're getting more worry lines every day, Shem. Now, while those streaks of gray are quite handsome, those wrinkles around your eyes really must stop. Mari, I'm a big girl, Shem. Your duty to me is fulfilled. Now go on to your next concern on your very long list. And don't forget to go home to Kala every now and then. She's getting as many worry lines as you are." Shem nodded at her, at Jatsi, and jogged down the stairs to his horse. He tried to ignore the terrible feeling in his gut that Mari Shin wouldn't be at the ancient temple site that day. It was right in front of Shin, the long, narrow glacial valley. He'd been following the trail for the past quarter-mile. There simply wasn't any way for him to make it more difficult or confuse the army into going into another direction. Not with Amory around. She was behind him about 100 paces, squealing so loudly that everyone, if anyone was still at the fort, would know they were approaching. "That's it?" Reg asked as the trail widened and opened onto the hidden valley. "I never would have guessed anything like this existed near the top of a mountain." Cloudman nodded in appreciation. "It'd be concealed by heavy clouds. Where's the fort?" Reg looked around. "Hey, there's no fort." Sergeant Beavid, a few paces behind them, jogged to catch up. "What do you mean there's no fort?" "The fort's there," Shin sighed. "It'd only be a matter of time before tens of thousands of men crowding the valley, 3/4 of a mile long and just over half a mile wide, would have discovered the hidden structure in the dense stand of trees." He glanced surreptitiously to where the scouts generally hid, watching for anyone entering the glacial meadows. The spots in the trees were bare, but maybe new locations had been made since he'd left for the world. Buddy and Pal joined Shin and his accompaniment as they entered the valley. Still covered in slushy melting snow, 2 feet deep, they could walk side by side, although ploddingly. "This is incredible," Pal breathed. "Look how the mountains rise up on either side, like someone took a big scoop of the mountain away." "It was a glacier," Shin said dully. "There used to be big chunks of ice that never melted. They slid slowly down the mountains, digging out sections as they went. That's what carved this." The men looked around to verify his explanation. "Chunks of ice!" a voice came from behind them. Teach panted to catch up. "Glaciers don't exist. Never heard of them." "Not surprised," Shin intoned, "but they do exist." "How do you know?" "Salemites know a great deal more than anyone in the world," he said flatly. "They've seen a great deal more, too. We explore. Many of our scientists have seen glaciers further north. This area used to be much colder a long time ago." "Nonsense!" Teach exclaimed. "The world doesn't change like that. It remains unchanged and steady." "Just like Mount Deceit?" Shin suggested. Teach opened his mouth, then closed it again. Another soldier jogged up to them. "General Thorne wants you to head to the fort, if it's still here." "It's here. It's straight ahead." He headed for the large cluster of trees in the middle of the empty valley. In weeding season, the valley was filled with wild flowers, and a gentle stream flowed from the bluish-green lake in the northeast. A small herd of elk also made its home in the meadows. He'd been there twice as a boy, accompanying his father to deliver recommendations to the fort from General Shin. Pugga never wanted to go there. The last time he did, one of his former lieutenants died. Shin hadn't asked the details, but he'd heard quiet stories that Lieutenant Raiden had been stabbed in the heart by his grandfather as he tried to run away from the glacial fort. Raiden had been there with Colonel Afra, who was at the time a lieutenant himself, and volunteered to go back to the world to hide the Shin secret that they were alive. After losing both of his lieutenants, Parent Shin never wanted again to approach the world. Shin tried to pull his grandfather out of the air now. "Are the scouts gone?" he thought. "Yes, young pair. They left a couple of hours ago. All of Salem knows the army is coming. They're already evacuating." "Good. Do they also know I'm in the lead?" "Only a few do. They also know that you're unarmed and that your little security detail is." "Mama?" Papa, Shem and Pato are keeping quiet about everything until they see what happens to you. And what will happen to me? It's up to you, young pair. You can survive this if you listen to me, or you can die trying your way. He was near the cluster of trees now, camouflaging the glacial fort. He headed straight for it as the soldiers looked around for something more obvious. It wasn't until he walked up to the door covered in dead branches that the hundreds of men behind him gasped and said a variety of, "There it is! Incredible! I would have walked right past it." He turned the handle and pulled open the door, but didn't get too far as he heard behind him, "Make way! Make way for the general!" Shin stepped aside and let Thorne's guard, with their swords out and ready, stride past him. Thorne followed after a moment and stepped into the reception room next, with several other soldiers following. Shin held the door and hummed tunelessly. "Come out now!" Thorne shouted at the empty fort. "Give yourselves up. You have no chance." Shin began to smirk. He heard Thorne and his guard tromping around inside until finally Thorne barged out, livid. "It's abandoned! Nothing! Everything's gone! Amory!" She was rushing her best through the snow to reach the fort and stumbled through the door which Shin still held open. Glowering, Thorne gestured with his sword for Shin to follow them. Everything was gone. There was nothing to loot, nothing to use. Shin glanced up to see where the ladder was that normally rose to the top of the tallest tree, but the roof had only a man-sized hole in it, which would appear odd to those who didn't know why it was there. At his feet was a pile of chopped wood, the latter masquerading as kindling. Amory charged down the narrow, twisting building to the supply room. Her cry of dismay intrigued Shin enough to follow. The shelves, typically stocked with food, clothing, boots, blankets, medical supplies, and even toys for scared children, were bare. Amory rushed to the next room, an eating room surgery area that was also emptied. Even the long table that stood in the room was dashed to pieces. Thorne was standing with his left hand on his hip in the room just beyond, where hanging net slings could sleep up to 30 people. The hooks in the ceiling and walls were still visible, but there were no nets, and all of the cots were missing. Thorne glared at Amory, and she shrugged back helplessly. Shin grinned to himself that Salem had looted itself, leaving nothing for the invading army. "They must have seen us coming," Amory whimpered, then remembered. "The horses!" She ran through the large washing room, out the back door, along the narrow path between the trees, and onto the stables that were also well camouflaged. Thorne, Shin, and several other soldiers followed. She threw open the doors to see that not one of the 14 stalls held a horse. "We'll have to keep walking," she whined, leaning against the railing. "There should have been something still here." "Maybe no one's been back since Deceit erupted," Shin suggested innocently, although he knew from Pugga otherwise, and the bales of hay in the loft smelled somewhat fresh. "Sir!" came a cry from the other end of the stables. "Tracks leading north!" "Follow them," Thorne ordered. "See how far they go so we can be sure of our direction tomorrow morning." He turned back to Shin. "Obviously, they were just here. By tomorrow morning, all of Salem will know we're coming, won't they?" "They already know, Lemuel," Amory insisted. "I keep telling you about the scouts and message towers. They already know." "So we need to get there quickly, don't we?" Thorne said, still analyzing Shin's every muscle twitch. "Because they'll be ready for us, won't they? And how will they be ready, Shin? Every man and boy armed with swords and knives, every woman holding a bow and quiver full of arrows, just waiting to slaughter us?" He could no longer hold his tongue. "No, sir, they're not like you. They love peace and have no weapons. The only butchers there slaughter cows and pigs and poultry. You'll be the first beast that goes to Salem." Knowing what was coming, Shin leaned just out of reach of Thorne's furious slap, and the general connected only with air. But he couldn't lean away from Thorne's guard. Before he could snigger at Thorne's miss, 2 large men shoved him against the wall while Thorne marched up and put his sneering face just inches away from his. "You have no idea who the beasts are, Shin. I'll show you tomorrow. You have tonight to tell me what I need to know, or tomorrow the first animal I slaughter in front of Salem will be you." Then, seeing his opportunity, Thorne threw all of his fury as a fist into Shin's gut. As Shin gasped and tipped forward, the guards released him to follow Thorne out of the stables, with Amory close behind. "Nice sucker punch," he wheezed on his hands and knees. "Why'd I say that to him? Why'd I say that?" "Shin!" Cloudman came into the stables. He leaned out again. "Found him, Sergeant. He's just in here playing horsey." Cloudman fell on all fours, too. "Hey, Shin, this is a great place to sleep. Can I claim it as our camp?" Despite everything, Shin couldn't help but smile at the most agreeable soldier in the army. Pulling himself unsteadily to his feet, he said, "Sure, Cloudy. Check with Beavid first and tell him it's the best way to keep me contained. Then start pushing together the last of the fresh straw. We can all sleep comfortably." "But you won't see the stars," Cloudman reminded him. "Too many clouds tonight anyway, Cloudy. Did you invite them? It was a good idea. It'll help this night not be so cold." Cloudman beamed. "I did invite them. I did something right." "You always do everything right, Cloudy. Don't let anyone tell you differently." John and Teeman crawled across the summit until the glacial valley was fully in view. Silently, they edged their way down to some scraggly bushes, ignoring how wet and cold their clothing became because of the slushy snow they pushed through. They positioned themselves behind the bushes, and once they felt confident about their chosen hiding place, Teeman began to point. "See that stone outcropping right there? Aim this bull's horn." He handed over a long, curved horn. "For those rocks. The valley's natural bowl shape, along with those rocks, help amplify and redirect your sound waves." John blinked several times and turned to Teeman. "What in the world are you talking about?" A third body caught their attention, rapidly crawling over to them. "Guide Zenas told me what you're trying to accomplish up here," Woodson said as he reached them. "And I thought I might be able to give some assistance. I figured you wouldn't know, John, about echo triangulation." John perked up. "Ah, strangulation. Yes, I know a bit about that. Shem said I wasn't to harm anyone, but if you gentlemen agree that strangulation is the way to go—" He was drowned out by the other two's urgent, "No, no, no." "Triangulation," Teeman repeated. "Like a triangle? That's what I was trying to tell you. Those rocks over there. Point your voice at them, and your words will bounce off and onto those rocks there." He pointed to another outcropping on the other side of the valley. "They'll bounce again and eventually come back to us, like a big triangle." "Acoustic location," Woodson tried, but John shrugged at the unfamiliar words. "But if I understand correctly, whatever I shout over there will come back to us." "Yes," Teeman said, "an echo." "Wait, you never encountered echoes in the world, did you?" Woodson shook his head. "Only in a very large stone building or down in the mines of trades. Otherwise, this should be an interesting lesson for the army of Idemia." "And a terrifying one, too," Teeman agreed. "Do you know what you want to say?" he asked Afra. "Oh, yes." Afra smiled darkly. "I know full well what to say to unnerved soldiers. I've had decades of practice." Lemuel strode out of the fort enraged and edgy. Here was further evidence of Salem and its deceits, and now they hadn't even left him horses. Soldiers poured in by the thousands, looking around in wonder, and Lemuel knew that he had to— "This is where Raiden died," said a voice. It bounced disconcertingly around the valley, not loud, but distinct. Lemuel scowled. "Who said that?" he said to Healy, who was also frowning and looking around. "I don't know." "You remember Raiden, don't you, Lemuel?" said the voice again, almost ghostly, seemingly from the trees. "Raiden," Healy whispered. Lemuel searched his memory, and there, on a forgotten shelf, was the lieutenant. "In Edge," he whispered back to Healy. "He was assigned there the same time I was, but—" "Raiden died here. So will all the others. The last word repeated perfectly and sounded as if it came from different directions each time. The thousands of soldiers tromping into the valley paused in the snow and looked around bewildered. "Others will die. "Whoever that is," Thorne snarled, "shut them up." Healy glanced around nervously, trying to discern the origination of the voice. "I'd love to shut them up. Suggestions on pinpointing where it's coming from?" "Lieutenant Raiden died here. Thorne turned to Healy. "Get Shin out here. Force him to explain this trickery." "Killed by Shin. Healy released an anxious breath. "Slagging crate, what does that mean?" he gasped, because at those words even Lemuel Thorne paled. "Get Shin out here!" Up on the mountainside, John Offra, Teeman, and Woodson snickered into their jacket sleeves, making sure the bullhorn John held was tipping away so as not to send out their stifled giggles. Thousands of soldiers were frozen in their tracks, twisting this way and that to find where the ghostly words were coming from. Thorne was now yelling that it was all just a trick and to keep coming into the valley to prevent the army from backing up behind them. His soldiers moved very, very nervously. "Better than strangulation," John exclaimed quietly to his two companions, who were snorting into their hands, then spoke again into the bullhorn, once he'd gained control of himself again. "Killed by Shin. Raiden died here. So will others. His gut still cramping because of Thorne's fist, Shin stumbled out of the stable following Healy. It was only because the sergeant major was so insistent that Shin followed him, iron and hammer behind him. Soldiers were coming into the valley, but walking slowly and peering around nervously. Well, of course, Shin thought. This is terrain unlike anything they've seen before, so they're a little, "Raiden didn't die in the forests. Lemuel, he died here. Shin stabbed him. Shin stopped in his tracks, astonished, but Healy gripped his arm and pulled him along. "What is this, young pair? What's the voice?" "I don't know," he said honestly, as Thorne strode up to him, his expression a wonderful mixture of rage and terror. "What is this trick?" he demanded. "I don't know," repeated Shin, although he did know, at least part of it. Playing with the echoes was a reason people looked forward to going to the glacial fort. The pristine blue lake was one reason, of course, as was the fort and the wildflowers and elk, but no matter the time of year, the echoes were there. And this afternoon, with low cloud cover, it wasn't taking much to keep the voices rebounding. Soon everyone would notice they could make an echo too. But first, that quiet, unnerving voice was getting to them. Shin fought down his grin, as if a large percentage of the soldiers weren't already jittery enough. "You never knew the truth. Lemuel, mule. This is where Raiden died. "I know that voice," Thorne said suddenly, spinning around and searching the few trees around them. "Offra!" he bellowed, and the name came back to him questioning. "Offra! Afra! Afra! Shin couldn't help but smile and whisper to himself, Uncle John. That had been their unofficial name for the colonel the family always talked about and always worried about. Yes, they found him last year and brought him to Salem, and it looks like he discovered a way to make himself useful. Thorne, seemingly disturbed that even his voice echoed back to him, quickly regained himself. So, you didn't die under deceit after all, huh, Colonel? Some of his words came back on top of his first ones, garbling his message. But worse than that, soldiers arriving in the valley and hearing the echo were now trying it themselves, shouting and barking and cawing and belching to see if the sounds came back to them. They did, and the valley suddenly became a very noisy place. Thorne, frustrated with not hearing a response from Afra, but being greeted instead by rooster crows, swore under his breath. To his guard he said, Send out 10 men, preferably older ones who'd recognize John Afra, and tell them to find him and kill him. Up on the summit, John turned to Woodson and Tiemann. So, he worked out it's me. I thought it might take him a while longer, Tiemann said, disappointed. Oh, no, John chuckled mirthlessly. Lemuel's smart, very smart. Delusional, that's for sure. Probably more than even I am, John said, sounding exceptionally lucid. But I knew he'd figure it out. That doesn't mean we're finished, though, he assured Tiemann. They'll get tired of shouting and eventually try to go to sleep. That's when the whispering will get to them. And that ends part 2 of 3 of the 32nd day of planting. Thank you.